Hey guys, it's Mike 1013 for Flop Turn River. Today I want to talk about capped ranges, about identifying when your opponent has a capped range, and what you can do to exploit that range. First things first, what is a capped range? Well, a capped range is a range where the maximum strength of the hand is capped at a pretty low value. It's a range that does not contain very many monsters. It might contain a lot of air, a lot of okay hands, some good hands, but not very many monster hands. Clearly, if we can identify times when our opponent cannot really have a monster, that's a very advantageous thing to know. The difficulty, of course, is determining when those conditions apply. In order to determine when your opponent's range is capped, we need to look at his actions throughout the hand. We need to observe his tendencies. We need to look at the board cards and see how they affect how he would play his monsters. In many cases, you can look back over the hand and see that if he could possibly have a monster hand, he would have taken a different action previously in the hand. This happens a lot on wet boards, where you see your opponent call a street or two, whereas if he had a very good hand, he almost certainly would have raised, in order not to give free cards and in order to get the maximum value he could out of your draws. Because we're going to be looking at our opponent's actions previously in the hand to determine if he has a capped range, it's much easier to make such a decision later in the hand when you've seen your opponent act several times rather than earlier in the hand where he may have only had one or two decisions to make. So, there are only a few times pre-flop where it might be useful to put your opponent on a capped range. And on the flop there will only be a few chances as well. But later in the hand, on the turn of the river, when you can look back on your opponent's entire actions, that's when it really starts to be useful to be able to put them on capped ranges. Once we identify that our opponent has a capped range, how do we exploit this fact? Well, since his range is pretty weak, your bluffs should work at a higher frequency than normal. So it's a pretty good time to run a bluff. Also, if you think your opponent has a capped range and he suddenly bets into you, it's more likely than normal to be a bluff, so you should bluff catch a little bit lighter. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of spots where knowing that our opponent's range is capped helps us in making a decision. Okay, our first hand here happens at a 100 NL cash game. And there's a limp, a raise, and a couple of cold calls before it gets to us. And we go ahead and 3-bet with ace-jack offsuit, and folds around to the last cold caller who shoves. Now, let's think about his range here for a second. I hope you can see that he should almost never have aces and kings here, because he just cold called the first time around. Sometimes people will just call with aces and kings, but usually not facing a cold caller before them. So he probably doesn't have aces or kings. He should not really have very many queens or ace-king either. Maybe once in a while. He might have jacks. Jacks is like the strongest hand that he's likely to have that would be reasonable for him to have. And I think the rest of his range is going to be either bluffy air, like ace-x offsuit, or small pocket pairs maybe. But he should have hardly any combos of aces, kings, queens. And I guess very rarely he might have ace-queen or ace-king here. But I think we're flipping with him the majority of the time, and some of the rest of the time he'll have bad aces or just any two cards more often than he'll have a monster here. And so I think, given the fact that his range is pretty much capped, and plus all the dead money and pot odds we're getting, I think this is a pretty easy call with ace-jack offsuit. If it had been the original raiser, who then went ahead and 4-bet, that's a much different case, because he still should have all his combos of aces, kings, ace-king, queens in his range. But given that this guy just cold called behind another cold caller, I think his range is pretty weak here. Let's take a look at another hand. In this hand it's also 100 NL. We have 9-8 suited under the gun and we raise. Kind of a loose raise, but it could be a good raise depending on the table. We get one caller. He looks kind of like a reg. He looks kind of a little bit too loose, a little bit too passive. Kind of a tightish ABC reg. And we see a flop there. We flop pretty good. This is a flush draw that we flop. So we go ahead and bet. And our opponent calls. And the turn brings an overcard. And it also gives us a gut shot. So that's a pretty good card to barrel. So we bet again. And he calls again. And the river is a 6. It doesn't help us. We've missed everything. We have nothing. And we're facing this guy who called us twice. But if we think about his range, he probably doesn't have 2 pair and he probably doesn't have a set. He would have raised them at some point. Especially on the turn where there's the flush draw and there's the queen-jack on board, making open-ended straight draws possible. If he had a monster, or even if he had jack-queen and made 2 pair, he would have probably raised on the turn almost certainly, and if he had a set, he might have raised either on the flop or the turn. So I think putting all that information together, we can conclude that his best hand might be ace-queen, like if he floated with ace-queen and then hit it on the turn. More likely, I think he's going to have second pair. I think he probably has some kind of jack here, ace-jack, maybe king-jack suited. And so I think a bluff here is going to be really profitable, since we can eliminate a lot of the monster part of his range from his range, simply because he just called 2 times. So I'd go ahead here and bet again, and expect to fold a lot of the time. Thanks for watching. See you guys later.